Our second panel is on more democracy. And while issues involving war and the economy almost invariably trump other voter concerns, as it certainly did in 2008, I think it's fair to say, the process of democracy has to be a bedrock concern because process is policy. And if the deck is stacked against people who breathe polluted air or are subject to oligopolistic pricing or who spend too much money on Pentagon weapon systems that don't work because contractors and polluters have a bigger say and sway in congressional committees, that's a problem. And if there is a democracy audit in America today, there are some huge liabilities after extraordinary progress over 217 or 18 years from slavery to an African American president, from widespread secrecy to a Freedom of Information Act, from workplace democracy. There have been a lot of debits in the last decade in terms of lawlessness, secrecy. Apparently, and so one way out of that is to make sure that even though people may vote far more for their pocketbook than a pristine democracy, it's essential before all of the reforms are attempted or enacted to fix the mechanism. To quote a guy named Michael Waldman in his book, A Return to Common Sense, if we want to solve our problems, we have to fix our systems. So again, if Reagan, in his mind, spoke eloquently about freedom as a clothesline he could hang all other issues onto, a president-elect in 2009 could well speak about democracy as a grand red, white, and blue premise. With that, let me introduce in order our panelists. Thank them for their great literary contributions and oral to come. I know Maria is time-bound, so we'll turn to her first, but let me introduce all in order and then have them speak, and then I'll try to field any questions. Maria Echaveste was former Assistant and Deputy Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton, is a lecturer in residence at UC Berkeley's School of Law, Bolt Hall. She's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Second, Dawn Johnson, former Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, was legal director at NARAL, and is a professor at the Indiana University School of Law in Bloomington. Mike Waldman, who cut his teeth at the Democracy Project 20 years ago, is a former assistant to the President Clinton, and director of speech writing for him, is the author of several books, including My Fellow Americans, and has mentioned A Return to Common Sense. He's executive director of the Brennan Center for Legal Justice at the NYU School of Law. So Maria, Dawn, and Michael, if you could each take up to 5 minutes, and when you have 30 seconds left, I'll bark out the time.
Good, that would be great. And thank you, Mark. And I want to thank the Center for American Progress for giving us an opportunity to write a chapter. Christopher Edley and I, for those who don't know, my husband and I, were asked to write the chapter, an overview chapter on America's changing demographics. And what I want to share with you is really something that probably should be pretty apparent from the election, but we may need to remind people over and over again, is that the American experiment is one that is constantly reinventing itself. And there's a framework of deeply held beliefs that value freedom, but also a social compact that has as its core this view of opportunity for all. And if you look at our American history, we pits and valleys, and so what we tried to do in our chapter is really pose to make the case that this experiment faces a highly significant challenge. that comes from the fact that our demography is changing, and the fact of essentially an aging white majority supported by a growing racially and ethnically diverse younger workforce. And the question that faces the next president and also our country as a whole is whether that workforce will have the education, skills, and social safety net required to generate the human capital that America must have to compete successfully in the global economy. That in this increasingly interconnected world of ours, a country has only two things: its natural resources and its people. Everything else, as we've seen from the financial crisis, is mobile. And so this issue of human capital is particularly critical at this time. With the growing aging of America, the growing Latino population, the increase of immigration, also coming at a time where it interconnects with a political ideology of anti-tax, anti-government trends of the last 3 decades. And so the question, unfortunately, our brief conclusion is perhaps we will fail in not making the investments, partly because we have a continuing disability, though the election on November 4th may suggest that perhaps we've made some progress, that our continuing disability that stems from color lines and obsession with the other could prevent our country from making the investments it needs to make. And we use as our example the state of California, a state that I'm particularly familiar with, having grown there. But it is a state with a vibrant economy, the 6th largest in the world. It also is a majority-minority state. It is a state that is multilingual, multiracial, with a significant immigrant population. Yet in the face of this economic strength and diversity, California struggles now with a badly decaying infrastructure, transportation and otherwise, a declining education system, an overtaxed healthcare system, and increased inequality with both great wealth and great poverty. Many have said that where goes California goes the country. And for this reason, we focused on looking at the impact of age, the growing Latino population, the importance of immigration, and what the policy implications were for the next president. You heard Judy Winston on education, but the policy implications go to the healthcare system, to our preparedness for the world economy, the retirement of increasing minorities who perhaps haven't had a healthcare system that prepared them so that they could actually be healthy in their old age. All the trends are bad. I hate to put it so bluntly, but it calls out for ask the next president and his administration to consider diversity in all of its ways so that policies get made understanding that we are a diverse country, and that the oftentimes happens in policy making is sort of thinking about one group and kind of making policy for that group as opposed to all of us. What I take away from this election is that no longer will a president, indeed, I would urge any member of Congress or senator or governor or anyone else to think carefully that no longer will anyone be elected by appealing to only a part of the American population. That in fact, that candidate and our president-elect, I believe, was successful in appealing to a broad swath of people because that is who America is. So I have gotten the high sign, and as I said, I do have other time commitments and can only stay a few minutes. But it really is.
Because take a little more time because you have to leave.
Okay. It really is the twin concerns that we have of both the optimism that the election presents of President-elect Obama, but also the glass half empty that shows that, at least based on California's example, the way forward is not assured at all. And given what the next president is facing, the stakes for this country couldn't be greater. Let me stop there. I'd love to answer some questions, but I know we've got to hear the questions.
You do have to leave, Maria, right now?
I have to leave like in 10 minutes.
So out of order, let me give Mike Waldman the 1 minute warning for his remarks, and then yield some of his time over to Maria. And so out of order, does anyone have a question in particular to our first speaker about demography is destiny and democracy?
Back there. So Mark has asked the question of whether the focus on diversity should be looked at in terms of what does the administration look like, and is that a way to, what I heard, begin to respond to the problem. I think that's only one of the approaches, and indeed what was startling or interesting about the way this campaign was, I'm not speaking to the campaign, but the fact that it wasn't constituency politics as usual, that it really was about messages that resonated across, suggests to me that certainly diversity in an administration is important, because the best businesses tell you that diverse voices around the table give you better decisions. But what we're trying to do in this chapter is to go deeper, that it isn't just sort of tacit, okay, so we're more diverse. No, actually being more diverse is going to require us to think very carefully. For example, tax policy at the state, local level. Seems like older white people tend to vote, and they're not really in favor of taxing themselves because those children aren't their children. They don't even look like their children, and sometimes they don't even speak the same language. If we continue in that kind of boxing ourselves by categories, we will in fact not succeed in this century.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. By the camera.
Hi, I'm Adele Stan with the Media Consortium, and I was riveted by your opening sentence, really, about the aging white population supported by a younger and diverse population. What kind of tensions do you foresee emerging in our politics because of that dynamic?
Well, I think those tensions are going to play out in terms of, like, look at the federal level, the entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, versus investments in education, universal health care that benefits a younger population. You could see that, and given the shrinking federal budget, it may come sooner than later. And it's getting people to think that to think in blocks of people and not see the community, the American community. And again, because of our history, we've not always done a really good job of seeing people who are different from us as being part of the American community. Stop there.
No, last question from Maria. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Martin Klings from the German weekly Die Zeit. I have a question. What is California a role model, and what can we learn from California?
Well, I wouldn't call it a role model, a positive role model. But I do look at it as, I mean, it is a large, it deserves to be its own country, and I'm sure sometimes it wishes it were. But it does have within its own borders rural, urban, Latino, African American, Asian, long-term, new-term residents. And so if you start to parse sort of what's happened in the state, I mean, it's the home of Proposition 13, no tax, keep property taxes low. It's the home of 3 strikes, you're out, right next to New York, a criminal justice system that is about throwing people in jail and leaving them there. In my mind, what we have in the state of California, since I live there now, is sort of the prison system's kind of our alternative welfare system. That's where you go to get your teeth done and mental health issues. Now, is that the America we want? I would say no.
Thank you so much, Maria. Best to Chris. As you're exiting, the other Mark asked a question about diversity, and Maria's point that diversity is substance was borne out by the following true example. After Time magazine a few years ago ran a cover of O.J. Simpson where they darkened his face in a menacing way. There was a lot of objection. An editor later said, "It's the last time we'll make an editorial cover decision without a person of color in the room." Diversity affects content. Dawn and Michael, please. Yes.
Me first? Okay. Thank you for including me. President Obama and his next Attorney General will take office under clearly the most challenging of circumstances. Among them, the Department of Justice's own transgressions have undermined its ability to fulfill its many difficult responsibilities, and it's at a time when our nation faces extraordinary threats and challenges. So a few quick examples, I know we should be forward-looking, but a few quick examples will help illustrate the needed solutions. Particularly on matters of national security, a dangerous view of presidential power has infected the Department of Justice, including the content of the Office of Legal Counsel's legal opinions. Think, for example, torture and cruel treatment. In recent investigations, the Inspector General and the Office of Professional Responsibility uncovered pervasive improper consideration of partisan political affiliations in career hiring and the appointment of immigration judges. Many long-term valuable career attorneys have left the department after being excluded from areas within their areas of expertise, from important decision-making in those areas. The still unresolved U.S. Attorney controversy continues to tarnish the Department of Justice's reputation for impartial law enforcement. And a final example, which I think is probably the most serious, the current administration's excessive secrecy is corrosive of democracy. So what should be done? The overarching top priority for the next Department of Justice should be, and this is the title of my chapter in this book, the restoration of integrity and the rule of law. So for my remaining just 3 minutes, I'm going to very quickly try to give you 8 specific recommendations for my chapter. 1, in any new administration, there is an understandable desire and strong need to be forward-looking, but the Attorney General also has an obligation to investigate serious allegations of serious wrongdoing, and that's both to create a public record and also to uncover lessons for the future. 2, quickly appoint individuals of the highest integrity to DOJ leadership, individuals that are, of course, supportive of the president's policy objectives, but also individuals who can be counted on to tell the president no when the rule of law demands that. 3, restore especially the Office of Legal Counsel's integrity. OLC, where I worked, issues legal opinions that are binding on the executive branch unless reversed by the president or attorney general, which doesn't happen virtually ever. And so it is essential that OLC's legal opinions, again, become trusted as accurate and principled and not ends-driven. 4, the president himself must personally set the tone by publicly demanding adherence to the rule of law and legal interpretations that are accurate and principled, and also generally demanding that the Department of Justice be depoliticized. 5, DOJ should immediately implement this change direction in its counter-terrorism work, working with other agencies, including with regard to Guantanamo, military commissions, secret sites, black sites, extraordinary renditions, torture and cruel treatment, the whole range of counterterrorism issues. 6, the next administration should respect the role of Congress and the separation of powers. So the president needs to work with Congress if he finds statutory provisions to be problematic, not simply announce an extreme view of presidential authority that allows him to ignore and violate those statutes, and certainly not in secret. 7, the new administration should make clear its commitment to openness and accountability in very concrete ways. And I don't have time to list them now, but my chapter does detail a range of specific suggestions, including regarding FOIA, classification systems, executive privilege, signing statements, the release of OLC opinions. Finally, last but not least, the substantive work of the Department of Justice certainly must promote the President's substantive policy objectives. I'll just highlight 2 from my chapter. 1, essential to reinvigorate civil rights enforcement. And final point on the policy agenda, long-term agenda, we need comprehensive criminal justice reform, an effort that includes addressing our appallingly and unnecessarily high rate of incarceration, and we need a more just and humane criminal justice system that better protects our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Michael.
Thank you, Mark. And it is true that I did get my start at the New Democracy Project but nearly 2 decades ago, but back then it was just called the Democracy Project, which makes it, I suppose, the old Democracy Project. The premise of our chapter is that renewing democracy, even in the face of other immediate pressing policy concerns, must be a central goal and an overarching theory of the administration. And we do believe that there's an opportunity, a rare opportunity, for this to happen in a way that catalyzes more change and creates more democracy. These kinds of reforms are the reforms that create other reforms and create the possibility for even greater change. Now, going into 2008, the problems with American democracy were plain. They were long-standing: low voter participation rates, a campaign finance system that was alternately corrupt and absurd. Those were evident going into 2008. What has happened during 2008, as we all know, is that in many respects, the citizenry itself began the process of restoring the democracy. We saw with a spike in participation, a surge in voting, and an explosion in contributions in small dollar amounts through the internet that have begun to change and reliven and reinvigorate American democracy. And that had helped create the political moment we now find ourselves in. And the mission must be to turn this aspiration into an agenda, to tap this momentum so that it doesn't dissipate and so that it becomes a way to substantially and permanently enlarge the ranks of those who participate and the voices that are heard in policymaking. Let me just mention a few key areas that we talk about in this chapter. First and foremost, voting, the heart of democracy. Our voter registration system itself was designed 100 years ago to keep former slaves and European immigrants from voting. Former Presidents Ford and Carter looked at it and concluded that one of the main reasons we have had in the past such low voter turnout rates is we have one of the world's worst voter registration systems. This chapter talks about a solution that would transform the way we register voters in this country: universal voter registration. It's what other democracies do. It's how they do it in Canada. It's how they do it in England. Basically, the government keeps the list. Everybody who's eligible is on the list. They're on the list permanently. Any problems with private registration vanish. And that alone, if implemented in this country, would add up to 50 million people to the voter rolls permanently, substantially widening the ranks of those who participate in our democracy. We're very excited that there's tremendous interest in this in Congress. There will be high-profile legislation introduced, and it can make a very big difference in the life of our democracy. There are obviously other issues when it comes to voting. The chapter talks about them. Among these are, as Mark mentioned, the deceptive practices legislation, which would ban the kind of racist intimidation of voters. We strongly encourage the new administration to support the Obama-Emanuel bill as it was introduced. We're hopeful that they will. The second big area, of course, is campaign finance reform, a long-standing problem in American politics. This is a system where people running for office continue to spend often most of their time raising money. It is plainly also a system that, both because of what's happened in the real world and what has happened in the Supreme Court, the system has broken down. We do support public financing for congressional races as the best way not to clean up and purify politics, but to boost the power of ordinary citizens. But it's important that it not merely be seen as kind of your grandfather's or grandmother's public financing. There's an opportunity here to use public financing to boost the power of small donors and mass participation that we saw in this election, making sure that whatever proposals there are include matching funds for small contributions, so that the real revolution in campaign finance spreads to Congress and changes the system. There are numerous other proposals that we talk about in this chapter, ranging from restoring checks and balances and restoring proper curbs on presidential power, using the power of the bully pulpit to encourage democracy in other realms in competition, whether it's in redistricting reform or national popular vote, to bypass the Electoral College. But one structural thing that we do encourage, that Mark mentioned, is there is no Department of Democracy. There's no Cabinet Office of Democracy. These issues often can get lost. And so we encourage that there be someone tapped, an Office of Democracy, whether a standalone office or an existing office within the White House, whether it's the Domestic Policy Council or the White House Council, somebody be charged with making sure this is part of their job, helping to catalyze the changes in democracy. Why would this be a good strategy for a new administration? Well, if we don't see this happen, the forces of special interest stasis that have frustrated change in so many other administrations will return and will potentially render this moment of excitement and optimism a bittersweet memory. On the other hand, if we do see these kinds of changes, then this administration will be remembered, as many administrations, successful administrations, have been before, as widening the circle of participation, building power, bringing excluded communities into the political mainstream, not just as an artifact of a campaign, but as a new permanent reality in American politics.
Thank you. Thank you. Two quick questions, Don. During the past campaign, I read that John McCain had said, should he be president, he would eliminate signing statements, that where he would sign a bill but then say he wouldn't enforce part of it. Senator Obama said he would use it occasionally but not as frequently as President Bush. What advice would you give to the next president on signing statements?
I think President-elect Obama got it exactly right, not surprisingly. No, signing statements have been a fact of our government for a very long time, and what's new is the abuse, and that's what we need to end. Signing statements are a very useful vehicle for the president to communicate with the public, and so it's kind of ironic that when we have a government of intense secrecy, we had candidate McCain saying he would not issue signing statements, and that is an important way to say how the president interprets a law and how he will intends to implement it. The problem was President Bush would sign these laws, and in many, many, many cases, in vague and ambiguous language, so we didn't even know exactly what he was saying, he would indicate he might not enforce certain parts because they were inconsistent with his own view of his own expansive authority under the Constitution. And so what was wrong was his view of his own authority. And that is what I think President-elect Obama needs to make clear. He needs to, I think, repudiate that view of presidential authority and set forth a balanced yet appropriately strong view.
Well, 1 second. So
yes.
If he gets a law that
yes.
he thinks is 4 parts great and 1 part is a former constitutional law professor, suspect, or in his view, unconstitutional,
right.
then you would, so what's the difference between abuse and constitutional sophistication? The quality of the president's judgment?
Right. I've written many, many, many pages about this, and it's unfortunately a complicated...
Not a soundbite answer.
It's not a soundbite answer. It really is not. And I would say, quickly, a standalone unconstitutional provision sent to the president, he has an obligation to veto that. No question. The problem is when Congress enacts an omnibus appropriations bill with hundreds of provisions, among which there's, say, one small, clear constitutional violation that the Supreme Court, take the most extreme example, has already said is unconstitutional. No question it's unconstitutional. The president needs this bill. He might veto it once, they pass it again. So in that situation, when I was at OLC and every prior Attorney General to address this has said, the President need not veto that entire bill. He cannot comply with that one clearly unconstitutional statute. But it must be clearly an unconstitutional provision and not based on some made-up extreme view of his own authority.
I would never put down an author in a panel, so your soundbite answer is we'll know it when we see it. It's a Potter Stewart thing. It goes to the quality of the judgment,
I
which
wouldn't
you
say
can't.
that. Yeah, I know it when I see it is not something
I
you
understand.
ever want to aspire to. Certainly, that
Right.
standard did not work. Sometimes the issue is clear. There are sometimes, unfortunately, Congress does enact clearly unconstitutional provisions, like, and this is getting technical, but a Chadha violation. The Supreme Court decided a case named Chadha in which they said X is unconstitutional. Congress still keeps putting Chadha violations in these omnibus bills, and presidents need not enforce them because it is clear to everybody that that provision is unconstitutional. It's not only the president's personal desire to expand his own power. So I think it's not an I know it when I see it. I think some things are clearly
Sure.
unconstitutional.
Michael, do you think that the way Senator Obama raised hundreds of millions, about half of which in small donations via the internet and other inexpensive communication vehicles, does that undermine arguments going forward for congressional campaign finance reform because we're in a new era?
Well, first of all, I don't blame and did not criticize Senator Obama for opting out of the presidential public financing system, which itself is one of the things that needs fixing. The dollar amount of presidential public financing is simply too low to run a competitive campaign at this point, and it was set when the law was originally passed at 2/3 the amount spent by the McGovern campaign, which was, for all its virtues, the most unsuccessful campaign in American history. So the fact of opting out doesn't trouble me. It does suggest that we need to find ways to spread this very positive development of the small donor revolution, which was, among other things, made easier by the internet, to Congress. The fact of the matter is, for all the changes that we saw in presidential campaign financing, congressional campaign financing is basically the same as it has ever been. The small donor revolution is just a rumor on Capitol Hill. Members of Congress don't have, very often, the donor base or the ability to raise the small contributions. And so the advantage of a system of public financing and matching funds is it incentivizes politicians to go to the small donors. In New York City, where the Brennan Center is, there's a multiple matching fund system, and it forces candidates, if they want to raise money, to go do grassroots organizing in people's living rooms and backyards, both as campaigning and as fundraising. You can't ever take money out of politics, but you can change the incentives so that it boosts participation and broadens whose voices are heard.
Time has elapsed, but if you have a quick question, we'll try to get a quick answer before the next panel on diplomacy and security. Yes, sir. On the aisle.
I'm Adam Taylor with Sojourners. I was hoping that you could comment a little bit more about lobbying reform in the context of a new administration. Certainly in elections, we get a lot of bluster and a lot of rhetoric about opposing special interests and changing the way Washington works, and that ties into campaign finance reform, but also ties into the process of government and often lack of enforcement and lobbying reform. So if you can comment, what are the opportunities, what are the prospects, and where do you see some of the dangers?
I would say that the good news is that in the past 2 years, Congress has passed significant lobbying reform that did tighten up most of the existing loopholes and dealt with things like the K Street project, which were so highly abusive. To me, the most significant lobbying reform is campaign finance reform. In other words, it's understandable to point the finger at lobbyists as a class or as individuals, but the fact is the biggest way that lobbyists have influence, and there has been a tripling in the number of lobbyists in Washington in the last 10 years, is through the campaign finance system. If we broaden who people listen to there, we will make it a much more diverse set of voices heard in Congress.
Fred Hochberg, who wrote the SBA chapter online.
Ed Hochberg, same person. Michael, what about districting reform? Because it seems that it's less sexy, but it seems more pervasive in terms of how it distorts members and how and it actually, we may have a number of minority members in Congress, but it somewhat prevents them from getting to the Senate and getting to higher office because they're so sort of pre-described.
Well, the one thing that we do know that's going to happen is the census and the redistricting. And redistricting has become, you've had gerrymandering from the beginning of the country's history. In the very first Congress, Patrick Henry tried to gerrymander a district to keep James Madison from going to Congress. So this is not a new thing, but it's really gotten more and more pervasive in a way that diminishes competition. And now you have the problem of mid-decade redistricting, which the Supreme Court allowed in the Lulac v. Perry case a few years ago. This is something that is going to proceed at the state level. There is national legislation to change redistricting procedures in a way similar to what Governor Schwarzenegger just succeeded in passing in California. But I think that this is something where it's more likely that the bully pulpit is usable for the president, and also making sure that the way redistricting is done at least counts all citizens properly. One thing the new president has control over is the census. And the census, a lot of that is baked in the cake already. A lot of the procedures in the census are already set. But the new president should make sure that poor communities, urban communities, minority communities are fully counted, which right now they're not. And that will affect not the process, but the outcome of redistricting.
Thank you, Maria. Michael?